Hello, everyone. My name's Amy, and this is not something I've done before. You see, I play D&D, a game which uses imagination and scenarios to bring worlds and people alive. In that game, I'm classed as the Dungeon Master, the one who crafts the stories, crafts the NPCs, crafts the world around my players. And I've been encouraged by more than a few people to share my stories. So that is what I'm here to do. Throughout the time we're going to spend together, you will hear stories over vast campaigns. I've been playing this game for 10 years. You will meet many heroes and villains and overcome the trials and tribulations, just like my players did. And hopefully you will feel the pain, the sorrow, and the love, just like they did. Today, our story is about these three heroes. We have Minx. She was a gnome rogue, and like most rogues, she is cunning, rambunctious, prone to steal quite a bit. She tends to get the party in a lot of trouble, but she's a lovable character. One you couldn't see the stories without. We also have Harold. He tends to be more quiet, more righteous, being our paladin. He sort of takes a back foot to all these stories, weighing his options, whether to go and help the people or to follow his creed. His story and his journey is a tough one, full of heartbreak. And then there's Aurora. Aurora is our tabaxi wizard. Warlock. She's a warlock. Even now I forget. And she is, throughout these stories, so lively. So, I wouldn't say mature. She brings energy and love into the party, as well as puns. There's lots and lots of puns she brings. She also brings the light. Today's story is about these three, but not halfway through the campaign. It's about when they first met. You'll see later on that more people join their group as they become these great adventurers and these heroes. But like all stories, theirs started in a tavern. You see, they were thrust together by the Adventurers Guild. In their world, which is called Eden, it was connected by vast worlds and places by portals. And in order to explore these portals, you needed a group. You couldn't go alone, they were dangerous. So being thrust together and not sure what strengths and weaknesses they had, they decided to go into a portal, to venture together, to determine where their worth was. And so, after a few ales and some breakfast, they left the tavern and entered a portal. They found themselves on a beach, the sea behind them hitting the shores as the waves crashed. The beach itself was silent. There was no life, no sound, except for that provided by nature. In front of them was a cave. Knowing this was probably their destination, they decided to make a plan. Decided to go forth. And they entered the cave. And that is where their first adventure began. You see, their plan for sneaking into the cave was quite simple. They would stealth into it. Which was kind of complicated by one factor, and one factor alone. Oh, shit. The fact that the paladin was in full plate armor. And being in full plate armor, he couldn't particularly sneak well. He was like, gonna make a lot of noise, you're gonna alert loads of enemies. So they were also eventually preparing for a fight. And by sheer luck, the paladin actually managed to sneak into the cave unnoticed. So did the rogue. That's what they're known for, their stealth. Minx managed to sink into the shadows, disappear into the darkness of the cave. Aurora didn't do quite as well. You see, she was so prepared, light-footed. She sunk against the wall, trying to hide herself in shadows. The one thing the party didn't really recognise on is Aurora's a cat, and she got very distracted by a spot of light dashing across the walls. But that was distraction all she needed. She ran headfirst into the cave after this light, only stopping and tripping, and tumbled into 3 or 4 boxes that clothes and shoes came tumbling out. It was actually quite funny. The one that fucked up on the stealth wasn't the big burly heavy plate paladin, but the tiny thin furry kitty. Knowing the element of surprise was gone, they had no other option but to draw their weapons and carry on. The first room they came to, they actually didn't encounter anybody, but what they saw turned the stomachs of the paladin. Along the floors and along the wall were coated in blood. You could see sacrificial daggers and altars and piles of dead bodies. Whatever was happening here in this cave was claiming lives. And it didn't really sit well. The Minx wasn't really that arsed. She'd seen death before. Aurora was sort of on edge, but Harold, being this good paladin who fought for justice and honour to protect the weak, he couldn't let it pass. After searching the room and almost triggering several bodies to blow up, they moved forward, and this is where they had their first encounter with the enemy. It was a cult. It came to nobody's surprise that it was a cult. Didn't make them any less pissed off though, and so a battle engaged. The cults really weren't expecting anybody to come stop them, so the cultists only had swords, daggers, and a crossbow. That didn't really stand up against Minx, who had daggers for days. Harold had an axe. They would with 2 hands, he was gonna fucking chop some bodies. And I believe Aurora used spells. Using their turns wisely, one by one they managed to defeat the cultists. And as their bodies fell to the floor, they didn't just lie there, dead bodies. They actually disintegrated into ash. Again, this was something to put the party on edge. Whatever was happening, they didn't want the cultist bodies to be alive, to be discovered. Before moving on to the next room, they had a discussion. What could be happening? Where could they be? This cave didn't seem that big. And then they heard it. The first roar. The beat of the drums. The chanting. They knew their mission was urgent now. Whatever was happening, it was a ritual of some sort. Something was being summoned or something was being used. So they pushed forward. but not before the minx. See, she saw the daggers and the swords and thought, free loot, which any good rogue would. So that's what she did. She picked up one of the swords, ready to use it. Unfortunately, this ended up in a curse for her. Her hand burned, almost so that she had to drop the sword immediately. She cried out in pain. And when she looked down, on her hand was a sigil burned into it. The sigil, the same sigil that the cults had wore. It was of a open palm, closed eye. They didn't know what this meant, but later on in the campaign this became so much more significant to them. With that out of the way, with the rogues slightly hurt, they pressed forward, going from room to room, seeing horrors, bodies hanging upside down, stripped of their skin, rooms covered in blood and skulls. And then they came to a room that quite confused them. They came to a kitchen. You see, the kitchen was unlike any of the other rooms. It was clean. There was no blood. There was no daggers or sacrificial altars. There was no bodies. There was a few cultists, but they weren't in their robes. They were wearing chef's hat and aprons. Along the counters were ovens and stoves and chopping boards. There was a table set with food or bread, wine, cheeses, grapes. The party didn't give it any second thought and attacked. Again, the chefs weren't experienced in battle. They were there to cook. And easily fell to the party. But now the party was in a dilemma. The kitchen looked like the end. But they knew they heard chanting. They knew they heard the rhythm beat of drums. And they knew they heard the roars of a creature. But there was nothing there. There was no hatch. There was no secret door. There was nothing deeper. Maybe it was their imagination, they thought. And so they gathered up the cheese and the bread. And Aurora gathered up the wine, being slightly drunk. And they made their way back, searching from room to room with any clues. After about 10 minutes or so of going in and out of the room, searching bodies, searching ash piles, they found nothing. So they went back to the kitchen and started to ransack the place, opening the cupboards, lifting up tables. But nothing again was found, until they stumbled across one of the cupboards they opened. They see in the far back a slight switch or a lever, they couldn't really tell. They pull it, they hear the grinding of stone on stone, and they watch as one of the stone tiles on the floor slowly slides open, revealing a passageway down, a ladder descending into darkness. They were happy. Their fight was going to continue. They were going to stop whatever was happening. But in their back of their minds, they always wondered, were they too late? They had messed about so much, they had not found this secret passage. Maybe they were late. Pushing those thoughts aside, they jumped down into the hole. They didn't really use the ladder for some strange reason. They decided to jump into the darkness. And this is where Aurora's puns come in. Aurora, when I said Aurora brings light to the party, I meant it literally. She brings light. Aurora has this habit of casting the spell light on Harold's armor. And this is where it was all born from. In the darkness, she reached out and touched Harold's armor, casting light, making this warm yellowish glow cascade outwards. This is something she would constantly do through the campaign. And it would become a warmth to the entire party. Now in the depths of what seemed to be the lower arc of the cave, they found themselves in a different room. There was blood on the floor, there was bodies, but there was also spikes. There was also Iron Maidens chained to walls. A rack of weapons and tools. They found themselves in a torture chamber, and one guy faced them. This guy seemed to be a cultist in itself, wearing the same robes. However, he was much larger. You could see his muscles bulging and pressing against the fabric. His eyes were inhuman. He picked up a cleaver ready to attack. And once again, without any warning, the party was thrust into battle. This foe was a lot more difficult. This foe knew how to fight. He was ready for anybody. He managed to get in a swipe at the rogue and a swipe at Aurora. Getting a few good hits on Harold as well. Before finally Harold managed to run at him, pushing him against the wall, beating him down, pinning him. This was their moment. This was where Minx and Aurora would have worked together and kill the guy. He was so grappled and unable to fight. How could they miss? How could they mess it up? Quite easily, apparently, as they threw their blows with daggers and staffs and swords. And they hit Harold quite a few times. So not only was Harold battling a guy that was trying to headbutt him, but you had a little gnome rogue stabbing him with a dagger, and then a tabaxi warlock bitch slapping him with like a sword. After a few cries in pain and a few turns of tussling back and forth and back and forth, the guy finally fell. The party stepped back a bit, bruised, injured, Harold more than anybody. They began to use healing magic to close their wounds, but they were still exhausted. They needed a moment. And this is where the realization of they couldn't face every cultist in this room, in the caves. Like, what if there was 10 more waiting in the next room? How could they do it when they just struggled with a single guy? And so they devised a plan. Well, I say they, I mean Harold and Aurora. See, they heard the roars again. And they decided, what if they used that against the cultist? What if they did it so they thought that a dragon had escaped? Aurora's clothes were slightly torn. Harold could roar, Aurora could run out, distract the guards, screaming for help and pain and panic. Maybe that would be enough to scare off the rest of the cultists. If it wasn't, they would have to fight. Having no better options, they put their plan in action. Harold and Minx hid. And on their signal, Aurora ran out. Harold let out this mighty roar as Aurora screamed, falling into the arms of some cultists, begging for them to run. She told them that a dragon had escaped. That it was going to kill them all. Again, this roar came. They managed to use trickery and magic to summon slight flames. And with some luck on their side, they managed to deceive the cultists. It seemed a lot of them were new. They panicked, knowing that a dragon might have got out. They booked it, not really giving a shit of the room they were guarding. When they were gone, the party high-fived. They had done it successfully. And so they moved into the next room. This saddened them a little. As the next room was full of cages, stacked high on top of each other, most of the cages were empty, which was a good sign, they guessed. But 4 of the cages were full. There was an elf, a dwarf, and 2 humans. They begged the party to free them, that they had a mission, that they had to save a high priestess, a small girl that they'd been captured. Now here's where an issue rose within the party. An issue no one was aware of until right now. An issue that Minx is slightly racist towards elves. So when the elf got free, it wasn't a case of, oh thank you, will you help us? It was a case of, you're a pointy-eared bastard, well you're a short little stump. Insults were kind of thrown, daggers were drawn, lives were threatened. I think the dwarf had to hold back the elf, like they were ready to fight. This elf had no weapon, he was ready to go fisticuffs with the gnome. However, fortunately, Harold managed to step in and calm everything down. Learning the story that the prisoners were guards, they were like an adventurers, and they were guarding a small priestess to go to the next city. They were captured by these cultists, and that the priestess was going to be used in some sort of ritual and needed to save her. However, they were badly injured. And the guards room a couple feet down the hallway had all their stuff, had the keys to the altar room, and that they couldn't go face them themselves. So the party agreed, somewhat begrudgingly on Minx's side, to help them. So they left the 4 prisoners there and ventured deep into the hallways, twisting and turning, so they arrived at the guard's room. See, unbeknownst to them, the guard actually hadn't heard them. And they got the element of surprise off. As they creaked open the door, weapons drawn, they could see the guards sitting around drinking ale, playing cards, having a laugh. On the count of 3, they readied themselves and jumped. They rushed in to the guards room, weapons drawn, and began to attack. See, having the surprise round meant they could go first, they could gain extra hits. The cultists, being unaware and unprepared, ended up like the rest of their friends, dead. Their bodies turned to ash. However, on one of the bodies they assumed the captain had a key. This is what they needed to open the altar room to save the priestess. They rushed back to the prison, the jails. But the prisoners weren't there, they were gone. Strange, they thought, but they had to press on. It was now a matter of time. Once again, using healing magic, they readied themselves for the final battle and rushed, opening this large stone door. As it creaked open, they were faced with what seemed to be an altar room, but it was different. The floor itself was encased in gold. Thousands upon thousands hills of gold all around this room, but the gold was soaked in blood. In the middle was a pedestal. On top of the pedestal, a single glowing blue orb that pulsated with power. Beside the orb, they assumed the cultist leader. He was in a lot more fancier robes, his made of silk. He had a darker colour and the emblem stood out a lot more. In front of him, a girl laid emotional and motionless, but you could see the slow rise and fall of her chest. And a surprise to no one, surrounded in fire at 4 points, were the 4 prisoners tied up. They had been recaptured without any weapons or anyone to guard them. People just come and got them. So this was their final fight. They slung spells and arrows and daggers, trying to get to the guy. But it failed. Every time they would sling something towards his direction, it would bounce off an invisible barrier. They slowly worked out that the orb was making this barrier, power, something that would deflect them. Like they couldn't physically touch him. And he laughed at them. As one by one the 4 prisoners began to burn, slowly transforming their flesh into that of a demon's. They had to not only deal with the guy that was laughing and summoning demons and slinging spells at them, but now 4 flying demons that basically shot fire at them. It was a hard battle. They weren't really that well prepared. I mean, when a party's ever really prepared. They managed to slay each of the 4 flying demons. And then they did something quite clever. Instead of trying to go into the portal, the orb, whatever it was, they goated. They drew the guy out, taunting him, telling him he wasn't powerful. And it actually really worked. The guy, taking insult, stepped out of the boundary, out of his protective circle. And this was their moment. Together, they managed to slay him. Him being quite powerful, he was getting that physique of a demon. But he wasn't quite there. It seemed the party was just in time before he finished the ritual. And so they managed to slay him. A cheer went up. They'd won. However, they still couldn't get into that barrier. They still couldn't get to the girl. And now their eyes turned to her. Her chest had stopped rising and falling. Unsure what to do, they were all stunned in silence until a shatter rang out. Their eyes looked towards the orb, now laid in pieces on the gold around them. On the pedestal laid a single arrow. They could get into the barrier, it was no longer there. Harold rushed forward, picking up the girl. He began to check her pulse and her chest, trying to use magic. He was very low on it. They were too late. She had passed. There was nothing the party really could do. And then a portal appeared, ready to take them back home. They had slayed what evil lied within the cave. They had performed their duty. You see, this was the beginning of their adventure. But it was also a very important moment to them. A moment where they realised they couldn't save everybody. Sometimes winning doesn't actually mean winning. Defeating the bad guy doesn't mean won. With nothing else to do, Harold began to walk forward, past through the portal. The Minx and Aurora, of course, still saddened by the fact the girl was dead, started putting gold into their pockets, seeing the Master Vault and the cultists were dead. He wasn't going to use it. They began to put it in their pockets. And then they walked through the portal, their bodies becoming extremely hot to extremely cold, their hairs on the end of their hands, or the fur in Aurora's case, beginning to stand. It was a moment of silence. And in some sort of cruel joke, Aurora and Minx watched as the gold they had got began to disappear and crumble into dust. And then they were there. Back in Dragonfall, the city they all started in. Beaten, bruised, and exhausted, they headed back to the tavern. That was the end of their first adventure. But it wasn't the end of their friendship. It wasn't the end of loss and pain. In fact, it was only the beginning. As the campaign would continue, more people would join their group, they would grow closer. They would have many stories, obstacles, and foes to overcome. But they would have many more beautiful moments. But that is a story for next time. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the journey that you went on. And if you did, maybe next time we'll see a different story. Maybe next time we'll see our heroes grow. Until then though, thank you and good night.